The best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day. But if that's not in the cards for you this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. Be a better you in 2024 with Babbel, the science-backed language learning app that actually works. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel's designed by real people for real conversations. Babbel's tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. For instance, I've been using Babbel's convenient courses to help me learn basic conversational skills in German while I'm getting ready for a little trip I'm planning. It's not a language I'd ever studied before, but I find the lessons really easy and kind of like hand-holding me through learning a completely new language to me. And it's reassuring to know that with the help of Babbel, I'll be able to greet people, order food, and ask for directions without having to consult language apps while I'm in Deutschland. I'm still learning. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/vulgar. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/vulgar, spelled BABBEL.com/vulgar. Rules and restrictions may apply.
As someone who enjoys trying out different makeup looks but doesn't wear a ton on a daily basis, I like to focus on making sure I have high quality staples. And regardless of your makeup routine, you've probably seen Thrive Causemetics Viral Tubing Mascara. I've certainly seen it everywhere. It's in that turquoise tube and it's become my go-to for mascara because it doesn't clump or smudge and it comes off really easily with just water. So that mascara, along with all of Thrive Causemetics beauty products, are certified 100% vegan and cruelty-free. Their bestsellers have thousands of 5-star reviews, and it's easy to see why. Their products are great. I love a multi-purpose makeup product, and their brilliant eye brightener is perfect to use as eyeliner, eyeshadow, even highlighter. I'd recommend using shade Stella for that. They all have a shimmer, and Stella is this really pretty champagne color that looks great on a variety of skin tones. Something I also didn't know from all the mascara videos I saw is that for every product sold, Thrive Causemetics donates either that same product, another product that's needed more, or a monetary donation towards 8 major causes, including those impacted by cancer, domestic abuse, and veteran and education organizations. So refresh your everyday look with Thrive Causemetics. It's beauty that gives back. Right now, you can get an exclusive 20% off your first order at thrivecausemetics.com/thrive. That's Thrive Causemetics, CAUSEMETICS.com/thrive for 20% off your first order.
Hello and welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster and I'm a Canadian, and I wanted to say that because some people may not know that, some new listeners. I don't say that every single episode, and I don't feel the need to say that every single episode, but I do this week because I know that to people outside of North America, my accent, which is sort of a flat standard, the accent that Canadian people have when they grew up listening to a lot of CBC radio in their house, sort of like, I don't know, standard Canadian accent. Some people might think I'm an American, and you're going to become very aware of this episode that I'm a Canadian. And the reason why is because we're talking about American history this week. And American history is not anything that I've ever studied. It is not because I'm in Canada. You don't study American history in school. Which is interesting because in my high school world history class, we talked about like ancient Egypt and ancient Rome and lots of different places, not America. And then I did an undergraduate degree in history. This is also information for new friends, new people joining the podcast being like, who's this person? I did an undergraduate degree in history. My special interest has always been in social history. If I could go back and I knew the options that exist, I might have specialized in something called like scandalous, audacious, slutty chaos people from history. But that's what I do on this podcast. Anyway, so in my undergraduate degree in history, I took classes in Russian history. I took classes in Canadian history. I took classes in various things, never American history. But all that being said, I somehow have, like a lot of people in Canada, I think sort of American history permeates so much of the popular culture that we're all in Canada raised watching. Like you're just tuning in to watch your Saturday morning cartoons and suddenly they're making a joke about George Washington or they're making a joke about Thomas Jefferson, or like you're watching, I don't know, Full House, Family Matters, and suddenly the kids have to do a project about the Mayflower and the Pilgrims, or like, so it's about American Thanksgiving. So I kind of know some stuff against my will, just from like the amount of American pop culture that I've absorbed. Anyway, I'm putting all this into preface because today we're talking about American history. And I have a guest on who is an expert in American history. Thank goodness. I'm joined by Greta LaFleur, who is an associate professor of American Studies and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Yale University. This is their shit. Greta knows colonial America. That's what they study. So thank goodness, like Greta was able to join me to help explain that context of it. But also Greta's working with Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies gets into this story because it's queer history. It's trans history. Which, again, to new listeners, I am a cis, straight, white woman, and there's a lot of nuances to this stuff that I'm eager to learn and curious to know more about, but that I don't bring to the party. So again, Greta, amazing, perfect guest to talk about this topic. A bit more about Greta. Greta is the author of The Natural History of Sexuality in Early America and co-editor of Transhistorical Gender Plurality Before the Modern. Both of these books I used to research for this week, as well as referring to my ever-reliable, the multi-volume book that is in the library in which I work in Saskatoon, Canada, Women in World History, which is, I think this book is about, this volume that we have is at the library. I say we because, new listeners, I have a day job, and that is working for the public library. I think it's about 20 years old. So it's got a lot of I like to use it for episodes like this where I have an expert on. I just kind of bring these notes up in front of me to look at like dates and names and places just to kind of so I can follow along chronologically. And this essay by Harry M. Ward from Women in World History is what I was referring to when we mentioned it a few times in this episode as well. So, I mean, I'm going to say on this podcast, American listeners, this is the first real American history episode of Vulgar History. There's going to be more coming up in this season 7, part 1. So just get ready for it. I'm going to talk about American history from the context of not an American. And I think a lot of Americans, without realizing, so many things are written by and for Americans, but I'm approaching this as a person who's never studied this. You'll hear me in the course of this episode come to the realization that the American Revolution was not a thing that happened for one day in 1776, but in fact happened over multiple years. A fact I did not know until I had this conversation. So I'm going to be talking about America, Americans. Get ready. We're talking about your history. And also if you are, anyone, but especially new listeners who saw the show art, maybe you heard one of the ads talking about, a Marie Antoinette season. I love that. I love Versailles and I love Let Them Eat Cake and I love the wigs and the big skirts and stuff. Rest assured, this is still a series called How Do You Solve a Problem Like Marie Antoinette? But this is part 1. And part 1, I'm sort of laying the ground of this revolutionary era in which Marie Antoinette was born, in which she lived, in which she was executed. Marie Antoinette was executed as a part of the French Revolution. The French Revolution was inspired and directly connected to the American Revolution. So talking about the American Revolution, it all connects. And at the very end of this episode, perhaps you will be surprised or curious about how I'm going to connect this person, Deborah Sampson / Robert Shurtleff, to Marie Antoinette. But guess what? I am, because everything ties back to her in this season. Anyway, so get ready for some American history here on Vulgar History with special guest, Greta LaFleur. So I'm so happy to welcome Greta LaFleur to the podcast. Welcome, Greta.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, and we're here to talk about a person who, can you explain what you just explained to me before we started recording, what name and pronouns we're using for this person, please?
So the person we're talking about today is, I'm going to use two names for them, but those names together. So Deborah Sampson, Robert Shurtleff, and I'll often refer to them as Sampson Shurtleff by the two last names that they use during their life. And I'll use also they, them pronouns for them because they lived as both a man and a woman during their time in this world. There's some evidence that they actually lived as a man and under a different name at a different person or a different point in their life, but I don't remember what their name was, what that name was, because it was a short-lived thing. So we'll just say Sampson Shurtleff and they, them.
Yeah. So I really wanted to establish that right off the bat because this person, I keep saying this person because I'm just like, what do I say?
Yeah,
Sampson Shurtleff. Sampson Shurtleff is often written about as Deborah Sampson, a woman who disguised themselves as a man, which is one reading of their life. And then there's, I think, more recent scholarship is talking about Robert Shurtleff, a trans man who lived their truth, which is another reading of their life. And what I've read of your writing, you're kind of like, we don't know.
Yeah, and I really think that the we don't know is really important, not because I'm trying to deny any of their sort of trans experience. And I do think, to live as a man in the world and to join the military as a man in the late 18th century, it was incredibly risky. The penalties for it could be quite intense. There was a strong association of quote unquote women or anyone assigned female at birth who traveled with the military as associated with sex work, which was in turn, of course, criminalized, as it remains today in most places. The penalties for doing that were quite intense, and Sampson Shurtleff did it anyway. And so to me, that feels like strong evidence that on some level they were comfortable with their life as a man. And we also know that they continued to live as a man for a while and sometimes traveled under their brother's name for like after their discharge from the military. So I'm not comfortable calling them a woman, but at the same time, after they left the military and after they stopped living under their brother's name, for example, they resumed living as a woman. And I say resumed because they had lived as a woman in a period prior to that, married a man, had a bunch of kids, but then also went on this speaking tour, and sort of resumed their persona as Robert Shurtleff and did military drills to sort of raise money to get veterans pay from the U.S. government. So I just think it's important to leave the question of their sort of gender experience open, not only because they have this really wonderful and rich history of living in different roles, but also because the way that people thought about gender in the moment that they lived in was really, really different than how we think about it today.
Yeah, I've done a couple of episodes of this podcast before where I'm still learning about how to talk about trans history and things like that. When a story doesn't fit exactly into the narrative that most people know about like a person who transitions and lives their truth, then it's kind of like, ooh. So it's just like the umbrella of trans history comprises lots of people living with lots of different gender presentations, and we don't know what the context was in their time. But for us today, we're talking about this in the context of they, them pronouns. We don't know.
Yeah, no, I like leaving it open. I think if we leave it open, we can kind of we can see different facets of what gender meant in that period. And I think being able to see those facets allows us to understand in what ways Sampson Shurtleff really departed from gender conventions of their moment, and in what ways their life kind of really walked in alignment with those conventions.
And then the other side of this conversation as well, because I'm in Canada. And so when I started researching this and the American Revolution and stuff, I reached out to my listeners who are Americans because I just wanted to learn better how this is taught in schools and what people think. And one person who I was in touch with, a listener about Sampson Shurtleff, who is a woman who serves in the military. And she was saying, like, she finds Deborah Sampson so inspiring. And I think a lot of military women do. So I also don't want to be out here like discounting people who admire Deborah Sampson as a woman who joined the military, because Deborah Sampson / Robert Shurtleff is an admirable, heroic person, whatever their gender. So I don't want to take that away from people either.
Yeah, and the thing I am maybe willing to take away from people is they lived a really interesting life and they lived very bravely in a lot of ways. But they were also like part of a military endeavor, and like one of the things I write about Sampson, like one of the things that they did during their time in the military that sort of garnered them such acclaim is they did like sort of like surveys on like what was then and now at times from the North American frontier, and like, settled it while perpetrating like some pretty intense violence against Native people. So like, it's like all of these things are true at the same time.
No, exactly, exactly. And so I'm really happy you're here to bring these nuances to this person who you've clearly, and listeners, like written about. You've obviously thought about a lot. You've studied a lot. So just bring these nuances that even for me reading like your writing and some other writings, like I'm still coming from a context of Canada and not fully appreciating the cultural significance of the American Revolution and kind of what that meant.
The Lord, yeah, yeah.
But also that's the thing, like even in Canada, the names that I had heard of about the American Revolution are like the literal founding fathers, who are all like wealthy white men who were able to read a lot, read widely, become educated, debate philosophy, and like that. But it's like, but the war itself, it's people like Sampson Shurtleff, like poor people are who's actually fighting the battles. It's not all like fancy generals.
Yeah, and one of the things I think is really interesting about Sampson Shurtleff's own history is they actually enlisted in the military twice. So the first time I don't think they actually there's no evidence to say that they actually served, but like let me back up and say that enlisting in the Continental Army and that at that time and place, you would get an enlistment bonus. Basically, you would get paid like a sort of one-time lump sum to get paid to enlist, and I mean, which still exists in some ways here here in the United States today. And the thing about Sampson's enlistment is that like you can't think about that out of the context of them being extremely poor. You know what I mean? Like Sampson we were talking about this before the podcast started, but like some people refer to Sampson as working class, and that's a little bit historically inappropriate just because like the divisions between class, like working class, middle class, upper class / wealthy, those were not really salient distinctions for the 18th century. Most people were very, very poor. And especially towards the beginning of the Revolutionary War, in part because of like colonial taxation procedures, people were really, really broke. Like there was, people in Western Massachusetts, like were on the brink of starvation. You know what I mean? And so Sampson, as a poor person, that would have been really, really salient for them. And that would have been a real live pressure. And so we don't know whether Sampson enlisted in the military to sort of, remove themselves from their sort of cultural community so they could go live their life as a man. They may have also enlisted because they needed money. You know what I mean? And I think I really want to honor that as also a origin story for a particular type of trans experience. If Sampson Shurtleff identified as a woman but lived as a man in order to like get this enlistment bonus, I actually think that is part of trans history. Do you know what I mean? And like poor people's history is trans history too. And I just like, we don't know what drove them to do that. And it could have been a mixture of both, of course.
Well, and that's what's interesting everything is interesting about this to me, but just in terms of like me trying to find writings about Sampson Shurtleff and wading my way through the kind of like daughters of the revolution, like look at this, like not just like this was a woman who presented as a man, which maybe, but also the stuff where it's like they were so driven by patriotism. They were such a patriot that they had to do this. They had to disguise themselves. And what you're saying is like they needed money. They were poor. So let's talk about where they are from, which is Plimpton, Massachusetts, near Plymouth. So there are 5 children in this family. So just in terms of like poverty and stuff, like the more children you have, the more poor you are, really.
Yeah, and remember, this is an era with no birth control. You know what I mean? So, like, I mean, maybe you have like, rhythm method stuff, but there's no real birth control to speak of. And so, people who were, gestational parents would sometimes, like, it was a real difficult part of like the condition of someone with a uterus. You know what I mean? Because if you were in a situation, especially if you were married, you couldn't control your reproduction in a lot of ways.
Well, it seems like what controlled the reproduction here was the fact that the father left them.
Yep.
Abandoned the family and soon thereafter died in a shipwreck. And so the children were sent off to board with other people because the mother couldn't support them.
Yes, yes. And I mean, and bored in, maybe bored, but also more likely is that they were indentured out. Do you know what I mean? So this was a really common sort of practice of servitude in this period. And, remember, there's no child labor laws at this point. Children would start working as early as 4 or 5 years old. And then they would sort of stay and be raised in the family in which they worked. But they would still be workers within the context of the family. And so that, I mean, it's this sort of complicated thing for Sampson, because it's also how Sampson gets educated. You know what I mean? So or I'm saying she in this moment because this is when they were a small child and they were like living as a woman, but or living as a girl, because they weren't a woman. They weren't an adult. So they were basically taught to read by the children in the family that they worked for.
And again, like it's so interesting to have the narrative of a poor person living in America at this time, which is there's exceptional things about the story of Sampson Shurtleff, but I think this would be so similar to so many other poor people. Like you're living in this too many kids, not enough money. Then the father leaves and you have no breadwinner, you have nothing. So the kids are just sent off. Like I'm sure this happened all over the place to lots of people.
Yeah, and the father, if he died in a shipwreck, there's so much, we have very little of like an actual solid historical record. I just want to say this because my moon is in Capricorn. I'm into details. And maybe he abandoned them. Maybe he went and worked as a sailor, because if he died in a shipwreck, he might have been working as a sailor. And sometimes if you went and signed yourself up for service as like on a ship, you might be gone for 5 years. You know what I mean? Like it was like shipping was like the way things got around the world in that moment, as it really kind of still is today. But like you would be gone and you wouldn't be heard from. Like there wasn't any mail, there wasn't any GPS, there wasn't any Wi-Fi. You know what I mean? So yeah, but yeah, he was gone regardless.
Well, and I guess it's another good point to bring up the how do we know what we know about them, and some of it is like regimental records and stuff exist, but part of it is this biography that came out during their lifetime.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and and tricky, a biography is an interpretive document too, right? So Herman Mann, who was I'm actually blanking on what relation he had to Horace Mann. I want to say it was like Horace Mann's uncle or something, maybe cousin. It wasn't like a direct relationship. Horace Mann is the father, people refer to Horace Mann as the father of public education in the United States. There's like a very fancy private school in New York, which is like the opposite of public education, called Horace Mann. But so Herman Mann wrote this biography of Sampson in order to help Sampson / Shurtleff, who was like living exclusively as Sampson at this point in their life, to help them make a claim for what was then called an invalid's pension, which is basically veterans pay from the U.S. military.
And so the story, I guess we'll get to that later, but I just want to let everybody know that the biography itself is I haven't read it, but it sounds like it's a bit sensationalized, and Sampson Shurtleff later was like, ugh, that part's not true.
Yeah, we don't have a ton of, Herman Mann actually rewrote the biography I think 3 times. The last one wasn't published, but he expanded it and expanded it and expanded it, which was a really common way of doing that work at that time and place. So yeah, Sampson wanted the cash, do you know what I mean? They wanted to be able to make this claim again, because they remained kind of poor throughout their life. It wasn't that they all of a sudden got rich. So they really wanted their veterans pension, and so they were kind of willing to do what they needed to do for it. They also went on the speaking tour where they redonned their military uniform and did military drills for crowds of people to make money that way. So we don't, as someone who works on colonial America or early national United States, I'm always a little bit reception history. Sometimes we really know what happened and sometimes we really don't. So I'm always a little bit on the fence about I don't know, the verifiability of some of these things.
Yeah. So, and just the fact, the detail, I assume we got from the biography, that their father abandoned them and died in a shipwreck, where it's maybe that's what Sampson Shurtleff thought, but is that what happened?
Yeah. Or, there's also a lot of historical interpretation. Historians will take, especially in earlier moments, will take real liberties. I don't know if you've read Alfred Young's biography of Sampson, which is a more recent book. It's called Masquerade, I think. But there's this Q&A section in the back where he's was Sampson a feminist? And he's No. Was Samson a lesbian? Like, no. Like, people just feel very comfortable offering interpretations, like very like definitive yeses or nos about experiences of people from like 250 years ago. I do not feel that kind of comfort.
Can I just ask you a question?
Yeah,
I
please.
have done a couple episodes about Catalina de Arauso. Are you
Oh yeah,
familiar with that story?
a little bit. Yes, I think a friend of mine wrote something about them. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a story where again, most of what we know is based on their autobiography, which almost 100% was written by a ghostwriter and not by them. And so there's like stuff happened, and then there's stuff that's like, well, that's probably just exaggerating. And then there's just like, ooh, lesbianism. Like there's just this stuff thrown in where it's like, this is just to sell books. Like,
Yes. Like with Herman Mann, for example. So there's like a lot of scholarship actually on like the sort of like sapphic craze at the end of the 18th century. So like Catherine Binhammer wrote this piece called, oh gosh, I'm trying to remember. Oh, I'm actually blanking on the article, but it's on the 1790s. There's actually a lot of work on interest in lesbianism at the end of the 18th century. So in the 1790s, like there's a book called These Fiery Frenchified Dames about Philadelphia. And so like people knew that that would get readers. Do you know what I mean? So like, is like, can we even trust Herman Mann? No, I mean, we can trust it the way we could trust any biography, but any biography is a sort of active interpretation.
yeah. And for me, it's almost like I prefer when the biography is so salacious. I'm able to sort of be skeptical about it the way that everybody should be skeptical about everything, really.
Yes.
It's
Yes.
easier to be skeptical when you're like, oh, okay, that's a bit much. Like,
Yeah,
yeah,
totally.
yeah. Okay, so I have a question for you as well, as an American person who
Yeah.
studies colonial history.
Yeah.
So, Samson Shurtleff is just like, indentured servitude, like work on farms and whatever. So, 1782 is the first time that they tried to enlist in the army. And I was like, wait, but wasn't the American Revolution famously 1776? It went on for several years.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Long time. Long time.
Okay.
Yeah. Long time. Yeah.
Didn't know that. Okay.
Well, and it's also like 1776. I mean, I honestly, I might mess up this history right now, but I believe 1776 was the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence is like the thing that kind of starts the process, but like it's a multi-year war. Like some people argue that the revolutionary period goes up into the early 19th century. You know what I mean? I mean, I like, I'm not a military historian. I actually truly do not care about the Revolutionary War as like somebody who works on American cultural history. Other aspects of American cultural history are much more interesting to me, but obviously it's a very important event or series of events.
Okay. No, and honestly, like that's just interesting to me because revolutions take a long time.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's interesting that, if we're going with the narrative of like the super patriot, it's like, well, why did it take them until 1782 to join up?
Indeed, indeed. And the other thing is that, like, the Revolutionary War, this is kind of something that I do think is interesting, wasn't a super popular effort. Like, most people did not support it. You know what I mean? Like, people were crabby about England for sure. There's a lot of anti colonial sentiment, but the actual revolution itself, like, people were threatened to join the effort. They were like people who were loyalists. Their homes were burned down. Their families were killed. Like it was a pretty brutal time. And I'm not trying to like defend loyalism or defend the revolutionaries, like whatever. Like the thing happened, and I'm not like it's not interesting to sort of litigate whether it was right or not because it happened. But it was a pretty rough time, and a lot of people did not support the revolution.
That's really interesting too, because the cultural way that it's understood now is just kind of like everybody was like, get out of here, England. And they all joined up
No.
as one to, no.
Mm.
Okay. Okay. So, and which also ties into the motivation of potentially just wanting to join up for money. So,
Yes.
what happens is, so 1782, also from what I've read, Samson Shurtleff, in terms of passing as a man, was like tall and broad. And so just physically was maybe more able to do that than somebody who was built differently.
Yeah, I mean, I do think of this like this is something that I feel like we talk about as like trans and gender nonconforming people today. Like some people's bodies code socially toward one gender or another, and that is real for trans people, for cis men and women. Like it's real. Like because like gender is a series of social cues, and so yeah, like they were supposedly a tall person. And that definitely would have helped them. Like, I'm a tall person, and I feel like I get read, like I get sirred more often as a result. Short hair, tall man. You know what I mean?
Well, and also I think especially if we're talking about 1782, like culturally, it's like men's clothes and women's clothes were so different. So if you see a person dressed, and we've talked about this in the podcast before, like there's societies where it's like, if you're dressed like that, why wouldn't I assume that's a man? Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And same to this day. Like, like, this is a silly example, but I went to, like, quote unquote, a women's college. And I put this in quotes because not everyone who attends quote unquote women's colleges are, for undergraduate institutions, are actually women. But like, they're like total hotbeds of like, queerness, lesbianism, gender nonconformity. They're like delightful places in many ways. Even as they themselves also have these like really complex histories. But like after graduating, like so many people I was around for so long were like, genderqueer people and people who sort of presented in like a mask fashion. And like I'd see, young like teenage cis boys on the street, and I'd be like, oh, a dyke, a dyke, a dyke. You know what I mean? It's like what you're used to sort of reading.
Yeah, no, exactly. So I think there's a benefit. And this is actually, I'll just let you know as well. So a few weeks ago, I did an episode about women in Mexico who fought during the Mexican Revolution, who dressed as men. And there was some of the descriptions, it's like, well, this person had like a unibrow and like a goiter on their neck, which
Oh
could
yeah.
maybe hide a Adam's apple. So there's certain physical traits that
Yeah.
maybe people would explain. It's like, and this is why, because that was another context where, actually, I'll ask you about this in a second, but in the context of the Mexican Revolution, it was some of these groups were very much just like, no women allowed, no one can join. So the women had to pass as men. But unlike Sampson and Shurtleff, there was a point, two notable examples, who partway through these illustrious military careers, being really successful with the rebels, were like, surprise, I'm actually a woman. And then they were kicked out.
Yeah.
And that's where I'm more comfortable with those stories being like, yep, that's a woman in disguise,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
they had this like surprise. But then there is at least one example of what in the podcast we talked about, like as a trans man, like a person who after the revolution ended continued living as a man, would like shoot anybody who called them a woman. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
so there's just these different experiences. But it was just making me think about the fact that physical characteristics made it easier for some people to do this than some others.
Yeah, and I think, I do want to just bracket one thing, and this is just like my particular vibe about this stuff, which is just that, like, you know, I I think a lot belongs to the category of trans history, including sometimes people who would not have themselves, by the metrics of our day, identified as trans. And I do think that people who identify as women but who live as men for a period of time to like join the military or do whatever they need to do, I do think that's part of trans history. Do you know? And I'm not sure like there's a way that people are like, oh well, Samson wasn't trans, Samson Shurtleff wasn't trans because they didn't live as a man. Like they went back and became like a wife and a mother and blah blah blah. And I'm like, I mean, it's so difficult even now to in a lot of places to live as a trans person. Like threats of violence, lack of access to work, lack of access to support. It's so difficult now. Like why would we take that away from Samson Shurtleff in their own moment, where it was even like where gender roles were maybe much more rigid for like white working people, if that makes sense.
No, and that's where what I'm like continue to learn, and that's why I'm so happy you're on the podcast. Like every time I have a trans history, I try to have a guest on because I'm just like, I need help
Yeah.
explaining this and understanding this. But that's where what I'm coming to understand is the difference between like trans history and like a trans person. And
Exactly.
you can't speak about a person's experience, but we can say, well, this is part of trans history.
Yes.
And
Yes.
yeah.
Because I think I think broadly people who flout like gender norms and gendered expectations, like to my mind, do belong in trans history because of that like way of living. It doesn't really matter. Like right now, our understanding of transness and gender nonconformity is very tied to like self-identification, but that has not always been the case, And I want to just like shout out to like colleagues in Black studies who work at the intersections of Black studies and trans studies, because I think like people like Riley Snorton, for example, or Natasha Tinsley have really like actually like looked at the way that, for example, because of the way that Black people and Black femininity in particular, Black womanhood in particular, has sort of been, because of like the way that white supremacy shapes gender norms, that like Black women have, like even cisgender Black women have been sort of like exiled to the margins of gender normativity, even as many people have like been themselves defined, like imagine themselves as gender normative. And so I think that's those people are part of trans history too, I think. You know what I mean? So that's just my shout out here.
No, and thank you for that as well, because yeah, like we're going to get to with Samson Shurtleff and like their runs with indigenous people, but yeah, this is
Yeah.
also very much and a story that I think is similar to that of other poor white people in America at the time. There was lots of poor, not white people in America at the time who would have different life experiences. But it sounds like so the first time they tried to sign up for the army, somebody recognized. They're like, "Oh, Deborah,"
Yeah.
and yeah, somebody who knew them. And what this says is, I don't know what you think about this, but it says like because Samson Shurtleff had an awkward way of holding a quill because a part of one of their fingers was missing, like something very distinctive that was like, oh, Deborah, oh, that's interesting. You're missing that forefinger, just like Deborah. Wait a minute, that is Deborah. Like, I don't know. It's same as having like a distinctive birthmark or something. Anyway, so whatever happened, they were not accepted at this point.
Yeah, we know that, like, I mean, that's interesting. I actually haven't heard that story. Where is this coming from, out of curiosity?
This is coming from it's the Women in World History essay
Okay,
about
gotcha.
them.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I don't know that story, but like, we definitely know that they did try to sign up for the military at least once before.
Hmm. I will just say, like this essay in Women in World History, it's a very expensive thing, and the essays vary in quality, but they're always just a good rundown. So that's kind of what I have in front
Oh
of me.
yeah, yeah,
And it's got a real like Deborah Sampson, a brave heroine of the American Revolution. I'm like, delete these paragraphs
yeah.
and get to the actual stuff. Anyway, yeah, this is kind of going through. So the second time, or I don't know how many times they tried, but they successfully enlisted as Robert Shurtleff, which is the name of her brother was called Robert. I don't know where Shurtleff came from.
Yeah, sure. Well, it's interesting. You know, I had a graduate student whose name I'm blanking on right now actually told me, who works in a period a little bit later than me, said that in England, like another word for Amali. So Amali was like a word for like an effeminate man. So like or like a gay person. Do you know what I mean? So Molly houses were like sort of house like body houses of sort of like effeminate men, and they were associated with sex work. Another word for Molly was a shirt lift, like Shirtlift. And so I had never heard that. This was way after like my book came out. And so I was like, oh, that's so interesting that like, I mean, I love the idea that Samson Shurtleff would have actually picked that name on purpose, but like the likelihood of that I think is actually low. But anyway, just a fact.
It's interesting that I don't know anyone taking on I love names is a thing about me, and so I'm just like wow, I'm like if I had to choose a fake name for myself, what would I choose? So like I don't know how much thought went into the name.
I know. Well, I mean, I will say that like Samson also lived. I'm not sure. Like, let me just say that like there's a lot of bad history about Samson. So they definitely also lived as they traveled under their brother's name. Another brother. So I don't. This is all just to say I'm not. I'm curious of whether they actually had a brother named Robert, but they definitely had a brother named Ephraim, and they lived as Ephraim for a minute too.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I don't know the names. I haven't looked at the census of people living in colonial America, but if I was trying to go like super undercover as a man, I'd be like, my name is Joe Smith. Like I'd choose like the most basic name, but Robert Shurtleff is like already. It's like, how do you spell that? Like to me,
Yeah.
I'd be like That's a bit attention getting. Anyway, so accepted this time. So I think is I don't know. I picture people in this time, like the founding fathers, they have their hair back in the little ponytails. So I imagine just like not cut the hair off, but maybe just pull the hair back.
Yeah, well, remember that like cutting hair is like difficult, and also like marks of normative masculinity. You wouldn't really cut your hair. Do you know what I mean? So like for example, beards. I mean, I think the thing that would have been weirdest about Samson Shurtleff it would have been the lack of a beard, because like adult men, if unless you were a priest or an actor, or like a preacher or an actor, you were expected to have a beard. That was like a standard. So maybe they were understood as young, which is also something that I think like
Mm.
trans and gender nonconforming people today will really identify with. Like now that I'm 42, it happens less often, but like as a sort of like, mass presenting person, until like maybe 5 years ago, people would be like, oh, like, are you in high school? And I'd be like, I have literally wrinkles all over my face. Like, how old do you think I am?
Yeah. So, well, I'm just thinking of all these examples. I'm like, like Barbara Streisand and Yentl. It's just like, oh, a young man is how they were taken, probably. And so let's see. So this says, and again, this is from this essay, and correct me if you haven't come across this information. So it says they sign up for 3 years or the duration of the war.
Yeah.
Which is a really vague. It's like it could go on for 25 years, but like this is how you get your money. So that's what they did. Oh yeah, here you go. So because they looked too young to shave, other soldiers began calling them Molly.
I mean, see, like, I'm curious where people, I haven't, sorry, I think you sent this to me and I didn't read it because my work has been bananas recently. But I'm like, if we're being really honest, and you don't have to put this in the podcast, of course, I have some like healthy skepticism about like these sources. Do you know what I mean? Like, I would like to, like, I'm like, where are they getting this? Like, there's a lot of historical fantasizing that happens around figures like Sampson Shurtleff, which is not to say that it's wrong, and I'm actually here for the historical fantasizing, but as someone who's also done a lot of work on them, I'm a little bit like, I haven't heard any of this, so I've got some questions.
No, this is good. And I will also mention, I'm not sure when this is from. This is like, the public library is where I get this, and it's this kind of like multi-volume set, and this is probably from like 1992. So, and I think a lot of the sources are like women of the revolution, our heroines. And now for a quick advertising break.
As a podcast network, our first priority has always been audio and the stories we're able to share with you. But at Realm, we also sell some pretty cool merch, and organizing that was made both possible and easy with Shopify. When you think about successful businesses like Aloe or Allbirds or Skims, an often overlooked secret is the business behind the business that makes selling and, for shoppers, buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. That's because nobody does selling better than Shopify. It's the home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret that's definitely worth talking about is that Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%. That's more happy customers and way more sales going. If you're hoping to grow your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling, on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more, sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout we use with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/realm, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/realm to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/realm.
Seeking the truth never gets old, even when it hides in the shadows. Immerse yourself in the world of June's Journey, a free-to-play hidden object game set in the Roaring 20s. Solve the mystery of the devious gossip spreader and celebrate our 7th anniversary with exclusive events, never-before-seen decorations, thrilling mysteries, and exciting giveaways. The adventure and the gossip awaits. Are you ready for the journey? Download June's Journey today for free on Android or iOS.
People often look at me with confusion when I ask them what their only one in the room story is. They think it has to be like mine, where I went to a 600-person event and discovered that I was the only Black person there. I know. Horrifying, right? Hi, I'm Laura Cathcart-Robbins, and I am the host and creator of the podcast Only One in the Room. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's only one story. This podcast is for anyone who's ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone.
I'm Brennan Storr.
I'm Paul Bestall.
We're the Ghost Story Guys.
And every 2 weeks, we explore first-person stories of encounters with the paranormal from all around the world.
Then we have some fun reacting to those stories. We like to say our goal is to scare the hell out of you, then make you laugh.
Belief in the paranormal is not required. All you need is a love of great storytelling and curiosity about the world around you.
Come find the Ghost Story Guys on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else fine podcasts live, or at ghoststoryguys.com.
And we're back. Anyway, so at this point, they're in the army, and I feel like the army is just desperate for people to join. So there's probably also not a lot of skepticism. If someone's like, I would like to join, they would be like, please, yes, do. They're not going to be like, prove yourself. Like, they just want bodies, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so they're joined. They're like, I appreciate that you have as little interest as I do in the war itself.
Mm-hmm.
This is all just like this regiment and blah, blah, blah. So what this claims is they dressed and used the latrines during darkness. And I would presume, things you'd have to do to just not, I don't know what the setup is, but it's like, yeah, you're not going to use like the communal showers or whatever. Like you just,
Yeah. I mean, there weren't communal showers, but yeah, totally. I mean, just remember, we're like in the 18th century. Do you know what I mean? Like people were bathing in rivers.
yeah, it's true. No one is clean. Everyone's gross. But this also reminds me of like Jim in Our Flag Means Death, where just kind of like finding ways to just like not be around other people when they're doing certain things.
Exactly. And again, and this is part of, again, thinking about the way that trans people today and gender nonconforming people today have been forced into this kind of adversarial relationship with like quote unquote single sex spaces, bathrooms, locker rooms. It's, even things like, I don't know how much you follow like TERF stuff, like trans exclusionary radical feminist stuff, but like, there's a lot of like no trans women in shelters or prisons or like, you know what I mean? Because of the sort of quote unquote single sex aspect of those spaces. It's a highly sort of tendentious space for trans people then and now. And I think this is why I'm a huge advocate of like getting rid of single sex spaces. But yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly. So it's that the 1782 version of that same sort of thing.
Same sort of thing. Exactly.
Yeah. And just kind of finding ways. But also I wonder if the way that like the army was just like, we need more bodies. This war is going on forever. How skeptical or suspicious anyone in the army would have been. Cause they're just like, you're in the army. Great. Let's just be bros. Like, this is fine. Like, I do think,
yeah, I mean, I don't know, but like, that's the thing that I actually love about working on this period, and I really like have like I feel like an ethical and political and like emotional investment in like letting us not know and preserving what we don't know. You know what I mean? Because I think following people like Saidiya Hartman, I think like acknowledging what we're not able to know allows for what Hartman calls like critical fabulation, but like the project of like filling in like that with our own questions. Like even you saying like, oh, it's like, like they were trying to like sort of like hide the sort of configuration of their body. And like, yeah, like that must have been what it was like, but we also just don't know. And I think that like the process of trying to imagine what life was like for someone who chose to live like that is a really important process. I think it really changes the way that we think about history.
I think it does too. And I'm just trying to picture this situation if other people, how cool or not various people would have been with this, or if everyone's just kind of like, we're in war, we're all poor, like this sucks, we could die tomorrow, like who has time to care about this? I don't know.
I think it's kind of, I'm guessing it was probably all of the above. I can't imagine that no one there like was like, wow, like, this person, doesn't ever show their body. You know what I mean? But like, I also don't know what the gender norms around like men's spaces or, you know what I mean, men's communities were like in that moment. So we just don't know. But I also think that like, I think about the way that like community building happens in weird, sometimes unexpected ways when there's a lot of like stress and intensity. They were marching for like miles and miles and miles and days and months at a time. That's a lot. Like, I think at a certain point, you're probably just like, I don't even care. I'm just really tired. And you know what I mean? I can't wait to get where we're going. And I'm dirty and I'm hot and I need water. And you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, exactly. And I'm just thinking about, I guess it's probably a later era slightly, but just, like gentlemen's clubs of the 1800s or something, like those are all rich people who would be like, only men here. But this is just like you were saying, the intersections of like queer people and trans people and poor people and other marginalizations. Like I think poor people are used to just being kind of like, okay, like, do we have food? Great. We're friends now. Like there's not time to really.
And I don't like, we don't have a lot of, we just don't have a lot of information about like what their time in the military was like, and so I just don't know. I mean, one thing I will say about Sampson is that there's also records that suggest that they were kicked out of their church, possibly due to implications. It's not really clear. It might have been drunkenness, but it also might have been like sort of was perceived to be inappropriate racial contact, like contact with like a working Black woman who like worked in a house in their neighborhood. So it's also like interesting to me to think about like Samson Shurtleff is someone who maybe had some level of comfort across like in terms of crossing like social barriers, if that makes sense.
No, and that's really interesting too. That was like briefly mentioned in this as well. But yeah, so it's they were, everyone is their own unique, interesting person, but it seems like they were an outlier in various ways, perhaps, from what was expected in society. So then various injuries, but the one that is the most serious is a musket ball pierced their thigh. Can you talk us through what happened there?
Well, let me just start by saying that muskets were like the shittiest guns on earth. I live in the United States. It's like the home of like the gun. And what's happening down here is disgusting. But muskets they were really inefficient. They took a long time to load. You had to load them between shots. They weren't automatic or semi-automatic in the way that that guns are today, that most guns are today. They were not super accurate. If you were standing 20 feet in front of someone and shot at them, and you had really good aim, you might not hit them. Do you know what I mean? Like, they were not, you know what I mean? So let me also say one other detail. So that someone might end up with a musket ball in their thigh seems like totally predictable and possible. That also said, thigh injuries is like a very classic trope in representations of quote unquote women living as quote unquote men. Do you know what I mean? Like, that is you can find that in medieval lay. You know what I mean? It's a very old version of that story. And so there's a part of me that's is that real? I believe they were shot for sure. Do you know what I mean? And actually having a musket ball in the thigh would have been a less dangerous, because I know that one of the things that we know about them is that they were actually basically redeployed after their injury. So it does actually track that it would be in some sort of soft, soft tissue that's non-organ bearing. Do you know what I mean? So a thigh would be one of those places, right? Do you know what I mean? You could have a bullet go through, or a musket ball go through your thigh and maybe not hit an artery or a major organ that would actually kill you. But remember that mortality rates, as a colonial Americanist, every time I get hurt or get sick, I'm like, oh, thank God I don't live in colonial America. You know what I mean? Because I tore a tendon in my ankle about 6 months ago. And the first thing I thought was oh, thank God I don't live in colonial America. Because people just didn't heal the same way. And there wasn't, there weren't antibiotics. So an injury, a tissue injury could really, really end your life. So yeah, so that happened. Supposedly they were sort of discovered because they got sick and they got a fever from an infection due to the musket ball injury. And were discovered to have sort of a body that was configured in a way that we associate with womanhood now. And specifically in the biography, it's sort of rendered in this sort of titillating idiom that oh, and the doctor saw their breasts. But we don't really know what happened. But they were injured. There's good evidence there.
Well, and part of the evidence, I presume, is that later on after their death, that their widower was one of the things that they mentioned was that the effects of this wound continued through life.
Yes.
So there was an injury, which I feel like you're not going to get out of being in this army without an injury. Chances are.
One of the reasons that Sampson wanted what was then called an invalid's pension, but which was basically veterans pay. One of the reasons they wanted is that they were disabled after the war. Do you know what I mean? Actually, Don James McLaughlin writes about this in a really great essay. So anyone who's interested, email me or I can send it to you and you for this essay. But Sampson Shurtleff was also a disabled person. Do you know what I mean? And they wanted the invalid's pension because they needed a way to support themselves. They couldn't work the way they did.
Yeah. Well, and that's also what's so interesting to me about, again, everything is interesting about this to me, but that facet I hadn't thought about. But yeah, just in terms of Sampson Shurtleff and in terms of just all of the veterans, so many people fought in this multi-year war, that we call the American Revolution. And then after the fact, people are not wandering around.
They were wandering around. There was actually a lot of wandering, yeah.
Philosophically, people are wandering around, and so many of them would have these disabilities and or PTSD and different things, and there was really not support for that, as we see through when we'll get to it. But Sampson Shurtleff's trying to find money, and then her widower trying to find money and everything. Yeah, so injury, but the doctor kept the secret at this point, or not?
Supposedly. Again, this is all a part of the story that I have a lot of historical skepticism about. But yes, the narrative that we have is that the doctor supposedly kept Sampson Shurtleff's secret, and then Sampson/Shurtleff was redeployed.
So again, and this is sort of story part where you're like, well, this feels like a novel. This feels like a nice little narrative happening, but this feels like the movie Disney's Mulan.
Yes.
But what actually happened, we don't. But we know there was an injury, and we know eventually Samson Shurtleff was not, oh my gosh, discovered and kicked out. Like they discharged, like they were discharged in the usual way from the military. This is 1780. Oh, the war had officially concluded. This says the signing of the Peace of Paris, September 3rd, 1783. But you said like skirmishes continued, but basically they didn't need these battalions anymore.
Yeah, but also remember that like now we're talking about nationhood, right? So we're like, so now the United States, the new United States has this other problem. And the problem is the reality of the fact that this is a settler colony. Do you know what I mean? And this is a huge group of European Americans who are claiming land that had since time immemorial been controlled by, I mean, I'm not going to say owned because ownership wasn't the model that people use, controlled by, stewarded by, negotiated by indigenous nations. You know what I mean? And and this is not new to the Revolutionary War. Of course, like you have things like what's called what's referred to as King Philip's War. There's a wonderful book by Lisa Brooks about this. Just a really fantastic history of King Philip's War, kind of told like from the vantage point, or told kind of like organized around Native women. I mean, the United States is still Indian country, but it was really Indian country in a sort of very pressing way. And so the United States as a settler colony was really in a position where it was like, okay, so how do we like make claim to this territory, and also without the support of British military? You know what I mean? Like it was kind of, the early United States was a kind of hot mess, honestly. I mean, as it should have been. And, you know, of course they had no legitimate right to be there. And we still don't have a right to be in North America. But, so the military was also used to do like surveying, to do to sort of try to settle and also control territory that was on what was then called the like frontiers. So like, and remember that like the quote unquote frontiers were things like Western Pennsylvania. You know, we're not even talking about the Mississippi River. We're talking about like Western New York, Western Pennsylvania, Ohio, what's now Ohio. Anyway, I'm rambling, but yeah. So the military had like a different task after the end of the Revolutionary War.
And so, actually, just to sort of double back to so Shurtleff Sampson was in the military for basically a year then, so 1782 to 1783.
Yeah, I think they were there in there like a little bit less than 2 years. Yeah.
And during that time, there is, again, like this is like, I'm so glad you're here because just to sort of go through what happened and what was just sort of like, this will sell books. But there was an incident perhaps where they were directly involved in killing some indigenous person or people.
Yeah. So this is, I mean, I tried to like game out like the first time I like was writing about this, I was really trying to like follow the story that Mann was giving about like where Sampson was. Like there's no indication of where they are in Sampson or in Mann's biography of Samson Shurtleff. My guess is they were in Ohio, what is now Ohio, or claimed as Ohio, or possibly Western Pennsylvania. So like I was like, oh, maybe Lenape, maybe Miami. Like I was trying to like make an educated guess about like what the sort of political and cultural origin of the Native person they supposedly killed was. But I also like, I mean, do I doubt that Sampson killed a Native person? Absolutely not. I don't doubt that at all. But like in terms of the way that it's narrativized in the story, do I think that like that it happened as that story said? I'm not sure. Do you know what I mean? It's really sort of proffered in Mann's biography as a way of like solidifying the realness of Sampson's masculinity. And I think it's really important to think about like settler whiteness and sort of gendered freedom as these sort of mutually constitutive things, you know what I mean? Like the way that particular forms of gendered freedom in the United States have like really happened at the sort of like have like sort of occurred on the backs of like, you know, racial and colonial violence.
Yeah. So just whether it's true in the specifics or not, the fact that this book was like, here's proof of the masculinity and it's by killing an indigenous man, like the fact that would convince readers like, oh yeah, that is masculine. Like that just speaks to what culturally.
No, right. And that's intense, right? To think about that, like, oh, we take this seriously now because, you know, Sampson was someone who like worked in like the settler colonial project. It's intense.
Yeah. Well, and that's like right at the very beginning, you were talking about like, this is the complex legacy where it's not just like, yay, trans history. It's all, heroes. It's like,
Yeah.
it's like also colonial history, and it's also
and it's like one of those things where it's like I this is going to sound like counterintuitive, but like I want a world where trans people can also be villains. Like I don't want I don't want trans villains. I don't want any villains, but like there's a flatness that happens in like trans historiography where people are just looking for heroes and they're just looking for like models of trans life that like sort of reflect our own values in our current moment. And the thing is, like, trans people are people. They're good, they're bad, they're evil, they're, you know what I mean? They're wonderful, they're ambivalent, they're complex, like everybody else. And I always think about I think about Trump's like military ban of like trans people, you know, like when he was still in power, which will probably be reinstated if he's elected. And do I want that form of discrimination, of like anti-trans discrimination, to exist in the world? No. But do I also want like do I support US militarism? Also absolutely no. Like, and I'm the grandchild of like career Air Force officers, you know what I mean? Career Air Force people.
Yeah, and that level of, it's the same thing, like overall, this podcast, the project is kind of like women's history is what I look at a lot of the time. And it's a similar thing in that, where it's just like the history of women, there is a flatness to it where it's just like, look at these amazing women who did great stuff. And it's like Queen Elizabeth I, like, fucked up the world. Like, it's not just like what girl power. Like, it's the same. Like, I think everyone in history, I think it's just respectful to sort of interrogate them and look at their legacy and treat them as people, not just as like
exactly.
icons.
And like we can really take seriously the way that people flouted gender norms without saying like that all flouting of gender norms has good results. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, exactly. So, and that's part of why this is such a complex story. So they are discharged, an honorable discharge, and then went to, so this is post Army life. And this is post Army life where I'm going to just quote this terrible essay, just so you know, unable to resist the urge to cross dress again, she wore men's clothing. But one could also, how would you phrase, like, they just continued to live?
I mean, I don't use the phrase. Following my friend and colleague Colby Gordon, I don't use the word cross-dress to talk about like anyone in history, unless people who except for people who literally said that about themselves, which doesn't really start happening until like the 20th century. So I'll just, you know, I'll say they sort of like lived as a man, they donned men's attire, you know what I mean? So yeah, I mean, Simpson did live as a man. Samson Shurtleff lived as a man, maybe under a different name than Shurtleff also at that point. So this is the tricky thing about calling them Samson Shurtleff, for a little bit after the Revolutionary War as well. And there's some evidence that they went and sort of like used their brother's name and just sort of like worked like on local farms and basically did what like white working people did. They sort of went from town to town looking for work.
And I think what I saw in this earlier was pre-war, during the indentured servitude era. I think they did do farm work. So that's like a skill set that they have.
Yeah.
So it's just like, okay, I'll just like brush off these skills. And like, this is, and again, if they're like a tall, you know, a strong person, it's like, well, this is appropriate work. Like this, I'll get hired for this job.
Yeah, and like, you know, the gender division of labor among poor people, it just wasn't like stark. Like among wealthier people, yeah, sure, you know what I mean? But like among poor people, like, you were expected to be able to do most things, you know?
Yeah, no, fair. And that reminds me of other things I've talked about on this podcast that I won't tell you about. But just, do you know the story of Mary Toft?
No, I don't know who Mary Toft is.
Okay, Mary Toft was a woman in England who, her evil in-laws made her pretend to give birth to rabbit parts. This is in like around the same era anyway, but what I know, it was a weird story, and it's one of the most trigger warning heavy episodes of this podcast I've ever done. But anyway,
out of curiosity, was Mary Toft was she or they into like evangelical religion by any chance?
No, it was just her family wanted, it was during the time when it's like weird freak show stuff would make you money. And this is the thing. This is where I'm thinking to this story, where it's just like they were dirt poor people. And like she gave birth to actual babies, and then it's like you had to go back work on the field. Like someone would cover for her for one day, and then she'd be back working on the fields. So I was just thinking of that in the context of like women working on farms. I'm like, oh yeah. No, I've read about this before, where it's just kind of like, we just need the hands. Like, what are you doing not being at work? It's like, well, I gave birth this morning. It's like, you're fired. That's
But it
the
wasn't
vibe.
like you weren't fired because it also wasn't like free. It wasn't wage labor. Do you,
Oh,
you know what I
fair.
mean?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
yeah, you're like, you're not fired. You're just going to stay in something that's sort of akin to captivity here for the next like 7 years.
Yeah, just for longer.
Yeah.
Okay, so they're working on a farm, and then what happens here? Because then they start living as a woman again and also become sort of a celebrity.
Yeah, so I'm not really sure that period between like sort of traveling around and working, living as a man who may or may not have been named Robert Shurtleff at that point, and between that period and marrying and having kids, I truly don't know, because like by the time they start doing their tour where they're trying to raise money, and also like raise awareness for this campaign that a bunch of like sort of high profile white men have signed on to try to get them an invalid's pension. At this point, they were already married, they had kids. So like clearly there's like several intervening years there. Do you know what I mean? Or at least a few intervening years. And so I truly don't know. Yeah, like I think that's kind of, there's a kind of like absence of the historical record there. But we do know that at some point they start living as a woman. They marry a man. They have a bunch of kids. So then that person becomes Deborah Sampson Gannett. That's the name they're living under. And then they start this tour. So they get like Herman Mann, this very famous, or maybe not famous, but like sort of powerful political printer named Philip Furneaux in New York starts like taking up their cause and like wrote like this sort of long poem about them that got to like read at Congress.
So what this says is just some details that you can let me know if it's true or not. Actually, no, first I'm going to tell you a stupid thing it says. It's like, Sampson soon attracted a suitor, which is the dumbest way to phrase that. But anyway, so it says, so Sampson Shurtleff received no pay while in the army. This was not unusual, as most soldiers went unpaid from 1782 to 1783. The continental currency was worthless.
Yes.
What does that mean? What's the continental currency?
So I'm not actually sure exactly what the continental currency was, but so there was a huge problem in early America around money. So remember that you have a prior to nationhood. So like up until the 1780s, you don't like everything is just this concatenation of different colonies, right? So they're all British colonies. So you have the colony of Maryland, the colony of Connecticut, the colony of or whatever, all these different colonies. And everyone had their own currency. And the tricky thing is so like it was a huge, there's so much written on this sort of currency issues. And then there was huge inflation, like some currency was worth more than others. Some people just didn't literally know what currency was worth.
That just seems so
what I mean?
Overly complicated.
Yeah, it was a real mess. It was a huge mess. So like people, there are books and books and books and books and books written about this problem. But yeah, so and a lot of currency was just worthless. Like apart from the problem that like you couldn't use like New Jersey currency. I think if I'm remembering right, there's also like municipal currencies, or like there were currencies that were like there were multiple currencies within a particular colony too. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it was just like totally like total chaos. And also there was huge inflation problems. So like a lot of currency was worthless anyway. You know what I mean?
Is this, we don't need to get into this, but is this where Alexander Hamilton saves the day by making one currency? Is that what he did? Is that why he's famous?
Honestly, this is where, like, once we get into, like, I honestly don't work on the quote-unquote founding fathers at all. I know, like, so Hamilton was also instrumental in the creation of a national bank. I do know that.
Okay.
Or a national, like, yeah. I'm like a national, like, I'm not sure if it's National Reserve. I only know that, frankly, I'm going to shout out to a law professor I had, who, my constitutional law professor, who like played us the sort of scene from the Hamilton documentary, the Hamilton musical, where there's like a rap battle about this. But yeah.
No, and that's what I know what Hamilton as well is from
there you go.
the
Perfect.
musical. But I'm just like, money. He did something with money. This sounds like a problem. Perhaps he solved it. Okay.
I don't know if it was the currency itself, but honestly, don't quote me on this because I am not a Hamilton scholar. I don't know.
Well, it just seems like, okay, so the money, currency issues, as you just described.
Yeah.
Eventually, states issued veterans settlement certificates to be redeemed in the future, like an IOU or something.
Yeah, basically, yeah.
Which
like kind of like a bond,
Okay.
Like you can buy like a government bond today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But Sampson Shurtleff had not been given one of these. Evidently, they had lost their discharge papers.
Yeah, that's possible.
Yeah. So I mean, the whole thing sounds like chaos. Like joining the army, leaving the army. Like I feel like everyone's poor. Like of course, like was paperwork issued? Like of course it wasn't. Like this just is.
Yeah, I mean, well, paperwork probably was issued, but remember that like paper was itself a mess. Do you know what I mean? Like I work on a lot of, I mean, I do actually in our archives. I work with a lot of 18th century documents, and they are like, it's a very different type of paper than the paper we have today. And think about conditions. Like there were no trains, there were no cars, there were no buses. Like you were walking like if you're a poor person, you're walking. You know what I mean? You're getting from place to place by walking. Maybe if you have access to a horse, but like horses were expensive, so like, and you're walking in all weather. You're sweating into the clothes you're wearing. You're walking in the rain. You're walking in the snow. Like that's not a great. And you don't have like there's no like moisture wicking materials that like people like people are wearing cotton or wool. Your stuff gets wet.
Yeah, you can't laminate it.
Yeah.
So it probably just disintegrated.
Yeah.
So then there's this lecture tour. Or no, we're not at the lecture tour yet, at least in this document. It says, so at this point, 1792, Sampson Shurtleff sends a petition to the Massachusetts legislature, and 8 days later, they were granted the sum of 34 pounds, which who knows how much that is
34
now.
pounds. I'm gonna see if I can ballpark it. So like, what year was that? That was
1792.
Oh, I want to say that in our currency, that would be a few $100s. That feels like it. Like yeah, like about the right. But there are historical currency converters. You could just go online and look that up.
Oh, for sure. But it's not just like $40,000. It's not like go buy a house. No, this is just
no. Yeah.
Thank you so much for being in the army. Go get a hot dog.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, and then 1797, Herman Mann published a biography of Deborah Sampson, Robert Shurtleff. So this is where it says, although he interviewed them at length, the book contains much exaggeration and fiction.
Yes.
But this book, you said earlier, was part of trying to get the pension, was trying to share the story. Yeah.
And remember that, like, so that, like seriously, like 3/4 of the book, which I've read all the different manuscripts of it or the different versions of it, 3/4 of the book has nothing to do with their time in the military, like at all. Like it's about their childhood. There's a huge part of the Female Review, the 1797 one, that's about Sampson's kind of like unique genius. Like it's really focused on their educability and their thirst for knowledge and their like investment in like observing and learning about the natural world and like like a lot of it and the cosmos. Like it's really. It's like to me, it almost reads like a treatise for public education. Do you know what I mean? Which would track given man's relationship to education. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's kind of various goals of this work. It says here that Mann also prepared the speech for Sampson Shurtleff, which was delivered, which makes sense to get someone to write that for you. People still do that today. Get your speech writer.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So, and so here's the lecture tour. So just delivering this speech at various places and it says one of the first women to go on a paid lecture circuit.
Mm-hmm. Let me just say though, that that had a real precedent in some British people doing it, like Hannah Snell, very similar. There's a huge range of stories, like Kathy Davidson writes about this, of like, people who join the military, people assigned female at birth who join the military, then come out and like who join the military as men, leave the military, start living as a woman, and then tell the story of it. So Hannah Snell, like I think it's quite possible that Mann knew about Hannah Snell and actually like suggested that Sampson Gannett do what Hannah Snell did.
And go on this lecture tour, which again...
Yeah, go on this lecture tour and perform military drills, yeah.
Yeah, and that's what the lecture, it was like, here's the speech, and now I'm going to put on the uniform and like do some military stuff, and
yes,
people pay tickets to see it because like, again, it's just hustling, just like needing money.
Yeah, and it's like, remember the lectures were like, lectures and these kinds of public presentations were like a major form of popular entertainment for more wealthy people. So like, it's like we can go to the movies. People at that point could go to like lectures and plays.
Yeah. So it's just interesting. It just reminds me of nowadays, everybody has a side hustle and various things. It's like, use promo code Sampson Shurtleff for
yeah, totally.
Like that's the vibe. Just like trying to do whatever they can to get money, because like well, again, like there's, I think, at least 3 children. They're two, because of the disability, not able to work. So it's all just, what can you do?
Yeah, no, I mean, the lecture tour was them working, but yeah, they just, they were disabled and they start, like, this is, again, go to Don James McLaughlin's essay. And if you want, I can, like, I don't know if you link to stuff on your podcast, but I can send it to you so you can say it. Yeah.
Like, listeners, it'll be in the show notes. Yeah, because that's a really
Perfect.
interesting angle I hadn't thought about. But then we get into I was like, some little celebrity neighbor, Paul Revere, is friends of theirs. And Paul Revere wrote on their behalf to try and get this.
Yeah, a lot of people, they did have a lot of, like, kind of like, I think through Herman Mann and other people, they had a lot of, like, wealthy male kind of supporters.
I was like, Paul Revere, I know that name vaguely.
Oh yeah.
Famous person.
One if by land, two if by sea. Yeah.
Yeah. So they're this is just like where the quest for the pension like kicks up a notch yet more, where like other people like Paul Revere are writing on their behalf and stuff.
Yes.
And this is an ongoing thing. So like 1804, applying for the disabled veterans pension. 1805, Congress placed them on a stipend of $4 a month, $8 a month. Anyway, so like some money, but like not a livable wage, I would say.
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm trying to remember what people were making of that era. I'd have to look it up. Like, do you know what I mean? I don't remember on the top of my head. But if you think about that first payment of $34 or 34 pounds that they got, I don't know what the pound to dollar ratio was, but like, if you think of it as roughly about the same in that moment, $8 a month. Is that what you just said? $8 a month?
Yeah.
$8 a month, like times 12 what's 8 times 12? It's like, it's not 96. It's, no, maybe it is 96. It's 48 times 2. Yeah, it's 96. It is 96.
Good job. Yeah.
Yeah. No, yeah. But like, I mean, that's $96 a year. So that gives you a sense of what 34 pounds would have been. Do you know what I mean? So not a year's, it would have been maybe like a 3-month salary for a poor person.
And then also, again, like a house and a farm and children. So like, it's not nothing, but still it's not.
Yeah.
Which is just interesting, like, in the context of like the American Revolution and like all these heroes and stuff. It's like the veterans not treated well after the fact, even though they were so instrumental in winning, because you need troops.
And that remains true to this day. You know what I mean? Like, veterans are not supported the way that they need to be by the US government. Like, as much as I'm like anti-militarism, I'm very pro-person. You know what I mean? And again, I am the grandchild of a sort of career military people and also career police people on the other side. And again, I'm anti-militarism and anti-policing, but I'm also like, if the government is going to employ people to do its work, then it needs to support them after they leave, especially when they're injured, you know?
Yeah, well, especially when what they're doing is inherently dangerous, like with muskets and whatever. It's like to just be like, okay, yeah, it's like, thank you for your service. Like, that's not money.
Yeah.
But so this is like, I've lost track of like how old they are at this point. But so 1827, they die age 66.
Yes. So 66, 27. Oh God, I can't do that math in my head right now.
But basically, they've been fighting for a pension for like 25 plus years.
Yeah.
And it says several months before their death, when asked the value of their possessions, they replied all they had was $20 worth of clothing.
Yep. So that was pretty standard for a poor person, pretty standard.
Although I will say, because I do, especially right now, I know that a lot of the listeners on my podcast are American, and I have not until recently done American history, but I like telling people when there's places they can go. And the grave is, there's a whole wing in Rockbridge Cemetery in Sharon.
Yeah, Sharon, totally.
Where's Sharon?
It's central Massachusetts. Actually, my aunt lives quite close to there. Yeah.
Okay, so a whole wing of Rockbridge Cemetery is dedicated as a memorial to Deborah Sampson Gannett. So people who live near there,
I should go. Yeah.
Well, I mean, if anyone's there, I'm usually like, so this tomb in like Romania, it's like I don't know how many people are going to be in that neighborhood, but like here, perhaps people could go. But, and I always appreciate when there's a good memorial to a person.
Yes.
So after they're dead, so like 9 years later, Congress passed an act allowing pensions to widows of deceased Revolutionary War soldiers. And this is interesting because their husband applied for a pension, which is in terms of just like gender and trans history and stuff, because they're like, this is for the widows of soldiers. And he's like, well, I'm that.
Yeah, he's like, I was married to a soldier. Yeah.
Yeah. Which is interesting. So just sort of like a lot of, and I guess this is part of what we know is just because of these ongoing, like, not legal disputes, but just like petitioning.
Yeah, I mean, and petitioning was a classic 19th century sort of popular tool vis-a-vis representative governance. So yeah.
And so at first it was deemed that widowers were not covered under the law, but then they decided that this case was a worthy exception. And so their husband was given $80 a month, a bit more than the $8 a month.
Yeah, indeed, by a factor of 10.
Retroactive to 1831. Anyway, he did not live to collect because he died. He was 83, and he died.
Oh, okay. Dang, he lived for a long time as someone in that era, yeah.
I guess if you just don't get an infected wound.
Yeah. Oh, no, there were lots of other... I mean, people died from tooth infections. You know what I mean? Like, people just died from everything.
Fair, yeah, and there's like all of the diseases.
Yeah.
Anyway, so he died, and then Congress, I guess, was like, oh, well, which, to their credit, and I'm not going to ever say that again in my life, to the credit of Congress, they passed a special act giving their children as heirs the sum of $466 to be divided equally among them. So they actually did give some money to people in this situation.
Yes.
For once.
Literally once. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's like, first, it's like, okay, here's whatever I said, like $34. And here, $466, a bit more. So I just have a couple things here in terms of how they are remembered, which is a lot of like women of the revolution vibes.
Yeah.
So the town of Sharon has a statue in front of the public library. Wait, are you familiar with the statue?
No, I've actually never seen it. It's really silly because, again, my aunt lives like in the town next door.
But do you know, is the statue in women's clothes or men's clothes?
There's a lot. I've seen pictures of that statue. I want to say that they were in their military uniform, but I could be wrong.
Yeah. No, I'm just curious.
I'd have to look at. You could Google it. Yeah.
Listeners, you can too. There's Deborah Sampson Park, and then the Deborah Sampson Gannett House, which is privately owned and not open to the public. 1906, the town of Plimpton, Massachusetts, which is where they were from, with the Deborah Sampson chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution, placed a boulder on the town green with a bronze plaque inscribed to their memory. During World War II, a ship was called the SS Deborah Gannett. And as of 2000, the town flag of Plimpton incorporates Sampson as the official heroine of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
Yes, and Sampson, I believe, or Sampson Shurtleff remains the quote-unquote heroine of Massachusetts, which, I would love. I feel like Massachusetts could just call them, like, do you know what I mean? The state person or whatever. It's not deep.
Yeah, well, I personally don't gender the word hero, but I guess technically it is. But yeah, so they are remembered in various ways, but it's like, this is why I wanted to talk to you about this, because it's like, the memories are very much just like this woman who did all these woman things, and let's remember her as a woman, which is like not to take away from women who find inspiration in the story.
Oh, totally. No, I mean, not at all. Like, I mean, I'm happy with Sampson Shurtleff being remembered in lots of different ways. Like, I don't need there to be one narrative about Sampson Shurtleff. In general, I think that history is for the use of the people who are alive in the current moment. Do you know what I mean? Whatever that current moment is. And so if people want to have Sampson as a quote unquote heroine, fine. But I think also, I don't think that sort of eliminates their value as a sort of figure of trans history either. Also, just as another note, during a fundraiser for Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign in 2016, maybe 2015, Meryl Streep talked about Deborah Sampson, not as Robert Shurtleff, as Deborah Sampson.
Yeah, and I don't know. I personally just find it uncomfortable that she's like to remember this person is just kind of like, here's the homestead where they lived with their children as a wife, and isn't she a great woman? Like, it's just kind of like, it's an interesting person, it's a flawed person, it's a weird story, but to me, over anything, it's kind of like the veteran who was not acknowledged and lived and was poor. Like, that is...
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of fantasy that goes into all of this sort of historical production and narrativization, and some of it is based in reality, and a lot of it's not,
Yeah, but I guess, and this is like the area of history that you study, like the colonial period. Like, I think the revolution has been so everyone involved in it has been elevated to this level of like godhood almost.
Yes,
where
totally.
like, so everyone who was involved has to be this like amazing, super perfect person to create this narrative that then like America can be like, look at how we were founded by these heroes and heroines, and every one of them was remarkable. And so Sampson Shurtleff is just kind of swept up in that, when really they were emblematic of just the everyday poor soldier.
Yes. And I think that's the thing that's like, that people, I think there's a way that we don't want to think of historical figures as like there's a way we want to think of them as exceptional, and in a lot of ways Sampson wasn't exceptional. Do you know what I mean? Like Sampson Shurtleff was like actually representative of like one of the broader cross sections of European Americans living in the United States at that time.
Yeah, and so I'm grateful that we know as much about them as we do, just like to sort of stand in for all of the poor people who were living there and struggling. And I just feel it's like, well, we named a park after you and here's a statue, where it's like, well, you could have given them money in their life. I think they would appreciate that more. Now, I forget if I sent you this, but we'll talk through it if I didn't. At the end of all my episodes, I score all the people we talk about.
Oh, yes,
in 4
you did.
categories.
I did see this. I did see this. Yeah,
good. So the first category is scandaliciousness or scandalousness. How scandalous was this person seen by the people in their era and their society? And I'm curious what you think on a score of 0 to 10.
So I actually would say, like, if I'm going to do it overall, like in their early life, I think it was actually quite high. Like, I think about that detail about them getting kicked out of their church. That's scandalous. Do you know what I mean? So like in their early days, like 8, do you know what I mean? But as they go over time, like, you know, towards when they were giving the tour, where they did their, you know, their lecture and they sort of did their military drills, I would put them lower, like 5, 4 at that, maybe even 3 at that point.
Mm-hmm. So if we average that out to something like 5, maybe
5, 6, yeah, 5, 6.
I'm gonna say 6 just to bump it up, because
sure,
I imagine the period in which they were growing up is this very religiously, church and religion was so important to those early colonists, and to be like cast out of the church allegedly would, I think.
Yeah, but there were a lot of churches, like we're talking about the late 18th century, which is not Puritanism. I mean, it's like a descendant of Calvinism in many places, but like in Massachusetts in particular. But like I think like we're in a little bit of a different moment from like the Pilgrims. You know what I mean?
Okay, fair. No, but also thank you, because I truly don't know much about American history.
Oh yeah,
I'm like, picturing like
when we talk about Pilgrims, we're talking about the 17th century usually. Yeah, I mean, Pilgrim is not really a thing, but we're talking about early Calvinists.
Yeah.
Who are the people that people refer to as pilgrims? That we're talking mostly about the 17th century.
I'm going to go with a 6 for scandaliciousness. Although it is interesting that by the time that like the petitioning for the pension, going on the lecture tour, people weren't just like, oh, I'm going to go see this shocking person. I think people are going to be like, oh, let's go see this interesting hero.
Yeah, I think that was the vibe. I think the vibe was less hero, but like, oh, this person did this weird thing. Like, I want to hear about this weird thing. I mean, it's entertainment, you know. But remember, if it like, there's certain forms of like, think about what's it called? What was that like popular romantic BDSM novel?
50 Shades of Grey?
50 Shades of Grey.
Yeah.
50 Shades of Grey. Like, yeah, was it sort of tittillating? Yes, but people read it on the subway. Like, you're not going to read porn on the subway, but you will read 50 Shades of Grey. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So like, I think we're in the 50 Shades of Grey neighborhood over here with Sampson speaking to her.
I'm going to go with a 5. Let's just like,
okay, sure, perfect. Perfect.
The next category is the scheminess, which also involves, as I presume I told you, just coming up with a plan, just being resilient, being flexible to life circumstances. And what do you think about that?
I would give them high scheminess. I would say like 8 to 9, I would say overall.
And can you quantify that? Is because of the going in the army?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So identity? I think I mean, you have to secure some clothing. Clothing was quite expensive. Do you know what I mean? Like, I mean, the fact that Sampson said at the time of their death, like, I have $20 in clothing was like a commodity. So like you would pay people in clothes sometimes. So so they had to secure the clothing. They had to show up. We know they did this multiple times. They had to live in a very particular, very carefully thought out way while they were in the military. They spent years scheming about how to like secure their pension. So yeah, high scheminess, I think.
Definitely. Yeah. Significance, and you can interpret this however you think. So it could be to you personally, it can be to history in general.
So I'll talk about history in general, and I'll say their significance is high, and I would say that their significance level is a little bit inflated here because by virtue of the fact that like we know very little about like poor people who joined the military for the most part, like very little, especially like in the later part of the Revolutionary War, who weren't involved in any of the major battles. Like we don't really know that much about those people, you know what I mean? But we know a lot about Sampson relative to other people who would have been their kind of like class status and background at the time that they joined. And so and I mean, that's even outside of the military stuff. We don't know that much about like poor people who are just like living their lives in New England, you know what I mean? Even, in the early 19th century. So I would say like high significance in that sense, high historical significance.
Yeah, it's sort of like representational significance.
Yeah, exactly. And like a lot has been put on them. Whether or not it's right is a different question, but a lot of it has been sort of put on them.
So on 0 to 10, what would you say for significance?
I would give it an 8.
Okay. And then the final category, and I'm very interested what you think about this, is sexism. How much did sexism hold them back? How much more could they have done if not for that? And that's interesting because they kind of sidestepped around that by being a man, by like presenting as a man, joining the army. But then afterwards,
yeah, I was gonna say,
yeah. So that's where
the
it's
fact that they had to campaign for so long to get their invalid's pension, like that. I think that's your evidence right there. Do you know what I mean? And I think I do think I'm really interested in histories of like sexism, misogyny, racism, homophobia, transphobia, because I think they don't always have histories that map neatly onto like histories of like women, queer people, trans people, people of color, so I would say like, I don't even know that like the way that we think about gendered, like the relationship between men and women, I don't know that sexism is even quite the right frame, but like clearly the fact that they were a woman or that were understood to be a woman at the point that they were applying for an invalid's pension totally prevented them from having access, or not totally, but for a long time prevented them from things that they should have had access to by virtue of having served in the military. So that alone feels like, a pretty high degree. I mean, but at the same time, they also did things that people who are assigned female at birth, like did not usually do and did not seem especially held back by that. Although like, I like, there's a part of me that wants to preserve like that, like what if they were someone who like today we would think of as trans, who like would have lived their life as a man for the whole rest of their life, but then just kind of couldn't, like just found it too hard. And I think I wonder about the sexism and sort of cis sexism of that. So maybe I'll put like that as like a 6.5.
Sure. That's very specific. Thank you. But yeah, it's interesting when I like talking on the podcast, like someone like this who has sort of like overlapping different marginalizations to just parse out the sexism. And you can't really, because like everything is, it's like talking about like a Black person from this period. It's like, well, there is sexism and there's also racism, and kind of like, how can you quantify it? But these are the categories I invented 5 years ago, and I apply them to everybody.
Okay, perfect.
So let me see. I'm just doing some official math on my calculator. 28.5 is their overall score out of 40. That doesn't mean anything to you necessarily, but I'll just let you know who. Let me see. Catalina de Arauso only got a 23.5. So already in terms of like trans history, they're leaping ahead.
Okay.
28.5. Who, you know who they just beat is Cleopatra. So
okay. All right.
Cleopatra only has a 28, and this is our first ever 28.5. So yeah, so that's where they fit. Well, and also just in terms of like gender history, like Hatshepsut. I don't know if you know the Egyptian pharaoh.
No.
Hatshepsut was a woman who ruled as a male king.
Oh, I do know who this is. Yes.
And Hatshepsut has a 29, so they're just neighbors.
Okay.
Oh, and then in terms of American gender history, Louisa May Alcott, potential trans history figure.
Yep, totally see that. Yep.
29. So
okay, so I see that.
This is a good neighborhood, I think. Applicable. And that's what I find interesting to like to have somebody. There's like queens, there's whatever. There's aristocrats, and just
Yeah.
like to have a poor person on here just to sort of be like, yeah, treating everybody equitably on this podcast
Yeah.
in terms of these 4 random categories. 28.5. So thank you so much. I want to wrap things up by, you mentioned a couple articles, and you can send me those links and I'll put those in the
Yes,
notes
I
so
will.
people can
I will.
find them. But do you want to let people know like what you're up to, where they can follow along with your work? You have books. Talk about your books.
Oh yeah, I wrote a book that came out in 2018 called The Natural History of Sexuality in Early America. Chapter 4 is about Samson Shurtleff, and if anyone's interested. I also wrote, or actually I edited a book with 2 other people, with Anna Klozowska and Masha Raskolnikov, called Transhistorical Gender Plurality Before the Modern. And that came out with Cornell University Press in 2021. And that has I talk about Samson. I talk about Samson all the time. I talk about Samson in the intro and also in the epilogue, but there's a lot of stuff on trans history in there. I'm trying to think of other things. I've done a bunch of different things. And I also edited a special issue of a journal called Trans Studies Quarterly with my friend Serena Bassi and the special issue is organized around trans exclusionary feminisms and the global new right. So that's much more of a contemporary, sort of set of collection of pieces about the the gender politics of right-wing movements right now. And it's especially interested in the way that alt-right and far-right movements are kind of like organizing against, around transness as an experience. So yeah, so check it out if you want to. I'm sort of on Twitter at Greta LaFleur, GretaLafleur. I'm not super active on social media, to be honest. But yeah.
Good for you. Honestly, good. No one should be. But also just what you mentioned about the recent article, like that's part of why I really want to share these stories on my podcast, just to sort of like to continue to reinforce to people that it's not just like trans history was not just invented.
Yes.
Like there's always been people living outside of a gender binary
Yes.
like that this is not new. It's just people like Deborah Sampson, like the story has, I think, until pretty recently been told as like a brave, patriotic woman who had to cross dress. But it's like, but recontextualizing these stories in the broader umbrella of trans history, I think just that's what I feel I can do on this podcast is just be low key, constantly reminding people that like, this is not new. There's been people like, like it's Hatshepsut was like, whatever, 15,000 years ago. Like if you're talking about historically, it's like, this has always been a thing. Like, this is not new.
Yes.
Yeah.
Not in any way.
Thank you so much. Honestly, I could never have done this without you. All the American history nuances. I'm just the American Revolution was more than 1 month. Oh, okay. Like, I'm so clueless.
It sure was. Yeah. No problem at all. And thanks for having me on.
Yeah, you're the perfect guest. And yeah, thank you so much.
All right. Thanks.
So as our Marie Antoinette season, this thing that we're doing, a special new segment at the end of each episode, how does this person connect directly back to Marie Antoinette? So Deborah Sampson / Robert Shurtleff served as a soldier under George Washington when George Washington was in his army guy era, pre-president guy era. So George Washington was friends, and one of his allies was a French guy called the Marquis de Lafayette, who I know from the musical Hamilton. Actually, I said at the beginning about how little I knew about American history was mostly just gleaned from like cartoons and things. But also I am aware of the musical Hamilton. And when it came out, I was like, wow, these songs are a bop. What the hell is this story? Who are any of these people? And I did a lot of like digging around on Wikipedia, wound up mostly confused. And my ultimate takeaway was like, okay, this is a story kind of like Jesus Christ Superstar, where there's 2 guys and they're kind of rivals. And then one of them dies and one of them doesn't. And everything else just kind of faded away. But what I do remember from the musical Hamilton is that Daveed Diggs plays the Marquis de Lafayette, and it's a great role. Marquis de Lafayette is actually going to be a crucial person in a lot of episodes because he's really a guy who connects directly from Marie Antoinette to the American Revolution. So George Washington was pals, hung out with Marquis de Lafayette. Marquis de Lafayette, before he came to America to help out with the American Revolution, lived in France and was like an aristocrat, and he knew Marie Antoinette. And in fact, they hated each other. More on that in a future episode. So to get from Samson Shurtleff to George Washington to Marquis de Lafayette to Marie Antoinette, that is 3 degrees of separation. separating these two people. And I do want to also mention, as this episode was recorded and as this is being broadcast, first of all, it's June. It's June when you're listening to this. And it's Pride Month here in Canada and in the US and in the UK and other places. And the original Pride Month started the whole Stonewall, the first Pride was a revolution, as people say. And we're all about revolutions this season on this podcast. And the reason why it was a revolution in the first place is because, like the revolutions that we're talking about this season, not just like the American Revolution and the French Revolution, but just the small, one person just being like, fuck this shit. Like Marie-Joseph Angelique was in the first episode of this. Like the first Pride was just like, fuck this shit was the vibe. And then during my lifetime, as an elder millennial, there was a time when Pride was like, oh, this is nice. Like the stores are selling rainbow merch and like people are having like these nice parades or whatever. But it's like these days, queer rights are under attack. Trans rights are under attack, like through the government, just through like societally. There's so much shit going on. Businesses like Target are afraid to stock Pride merchandise in their stores because people are being assholes about it. Like, it's such a shitty situation for queer rights, for trans rights right now. And it's Pride Month, and we just did this episode about trans history, which part of why I'm doing these episodes, like this, I'm saying episodes because next week is also a trans history American story. Stay tuned for that. Is just as a reminder, the same way as I did the Hatshepsut episode a few months ago. Like, there's never been a gender binary. Like, in any society in the history of the world, there's always been queer people. There's always been trans people. Like, this is not new. It's always been like this. So I'm just hoping to spread the word and just get everyone to be like, oh, that's right. This isn't new. This is a thing that's always been around. Anyway, to actively help, because it's so easy to feel like this and so many other circumstances in the world today, the nightmare dystopia we're all living in, to feel helpless, but some organizations that are out there doing the work to, most importantly, support queer people, to support trans people whose rights and lives are under attack, even just the right to like use a bathroom, people who are helping those people. So in Canada, there's an organization called Trans Care Plus who focus on supporting the health, care, and wellness of trans and gender diverse communities through programming, research, and advocacy. In the US, there's an organization called Point of Pride, which provides financial aid and direct support to trans folks in need of health and wellness care. Also in the US, the Trevor Project is the leading suicide prevention and crisis intervention nonprofit organization for LGBTQ plus young people. They provide information and support to LGBTQ plus young people 24/7 all year round. So if you are able to, I do encourage you to support organizations like these ones. Maybe there's another one in the country where you live, or there's another one in your city. Just supporting people is, if you're able to, that's what I would suggest, rather than buying like a pair of rainbow patterned socks or whatever. Like, let's like actually help people. Claire Willett, she used to be on Twitter and now she is on Blue Sky. But a few years ago, I just saw like this old tweet of hers was trending, and it kind of spoke to me, and it sort of phrased what I've been trying to say over these past few minutes. She said, for Pride Month this year, can straight people focus less on love is love and more on queer and trans people are in danger? And just keep that in mind. Like, Pride this year, like, might be more of a riot, might be more of a revolution. And maybe it kind of needs to be. Anyway, this is Vulgar History. My name is Ann Foster. And so we did score Sampson Shurtleff on what we call the Fredigan Memorial Scandalicious Scale. That's named after new listeners. Just so you know, new listeners. There was a time where I read a book and I became so obsessed with this person, Fredigan. The book is called The Dark Queens by Shelley Puhack. Super recommend. Fredigan she has the highest score in the Scandaliciousness scale. She did not get a perfect score. She got a 38 out of 40, but I was so moved by her story and she was so important to me, I renamed the entire scale in honor of her, the Fredigan Memorial Scandaliciousness Scale. And so you can see everybody who have ever covered on this podcast on that scale. If you go to vulgarhistory.com, at the top, there's a thing that says scores. And so you can kind of scroll down to see where different people fit, like Sampson Shurtleff with the 28.5. In terms of other like trans ancestors, like Hatshepsut is there with a 29. I'm just going to see who else is where. Other people who you might know. I mean, Louisa May Alcott, who we did an episode about in a trans-affirming way, has a 29. Like, I just like when people who have sort of similar vibes sit together on the scale. It confirms for me that the scale is measuring something somehow. Anyway, so if you want to keep up with me in this podcast, so first of all, I do have a newsletter on Substack that's called Vulgar History a la carte. And so that's where if, you're listening to me talk right here, but if you want to read the words I write, you can find my newsletter, which is at vulgarhistory.substack.com. And the newsletters I'm doing there, it's not just like a written version of this podcast, it's different topics. I'm sharing essays there about specifically at the moment, Tudor history, which to new listeners, that was kind of my entry point into studying scandalous, audacious people from history, was Tudor history. That's kind of where I started, and then I've expanded from there. I did recently on there post essays about Lady Jane Grey. There's this new series that's starting up later this month called My Lady Jane on Amazon Prime, which is like a radical reinterpretation of the story of Lady Jane Grey. So read about her there, or also I did episodes about her a while ago. You can also support the podcast on Patreon at patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter. So there's a couple of things happening on there. Like, first of all, you can just join as a free member, and I post things there regularly, just pictures and like things to talk about and stuff, announcements, go on there. So you can just join as a free member, totally fine. If you join for at least $1 a month, then you can get early ad-free access to all episodes, including past episodes. Like, you don't get early access to past episodes, but you get ad-free access to all episodes of Vulgar History. So you get the new upcoming episodes, like I think about 4 days early, and you can listen to the previous ones without the ad breaks in them on there for $1 or more a month. And also for $1 or more a month, you're able to comment on various things. And there's also a chat there where we can just episode discussion, talking about what you thought about the episode, recommending books and TV shows to each other. If you subscribe to the Patreon at $5 or more a month, you get all of the above as well as bonus episodes. So I do, or have been doing, there's a pretty good back catalog. There's like 22, I think, episodes of Vulgar Piece Theater. And that's where I talk about costume dramas with friends of the podcast, Alison Epstein and Lana Wood Johnson. So most recently, we've talked about I, Claudius, the 1976 British mini-series that I have been really, really, really into lately. We haven't done any movies about American history. Oh, no, we have. We have done some about American history. We did Newsies at one point. Anyway, there's also some other special things you can find there. Sometimes there's too much to talk about with a guest, and so I take that to the after show. So those episodes are there. As well as sometimes when I'm researching a woman in history, I find a man who's so obnoxious I have to yell about it. And you can find those episodes there as well. Those are called So This Asshole. And if you just like to listen to specific episodes of Vulgar Piece Theater, you can just like purchase one episode. If you want to just listen to us talking about Les Miserables, for instance, the movie starring Russell Crowe, or Queen Margot, a movie that my co-hosts did not love as much as I did. Anyway, you can just get one episode. You can just buy an episode if you want to as well. And also, if you're just curious about the whole Patreon vibe, like, you can just get a 7-week free trial, listen to what you want to listen to, and then just like peace out. You know what? Whatever you want to do. I also want to mention our brand partner, Common Era Jewelry. So this is a small woman-owned business that makes beautiful jewelry inspired by women and other people, I will say, from classical mythology as well as from history. In terms of Pride Month and that sort of thing, there is a Sappho-themed necklace you can purchase from them. Hatshepsut is also there, sort of a genderqueer figure from trans history. There's also, other figures who you might be familiar with from mythology. Aphrodite, Medusa is there, and then also some figures we've talked about on this podcast before. Cleopatra, Agrippina the Younger, Anne Boleyn, and they're all on beautiful necklaces, rings, and you can get those in molten gold and also in more affordable gold vermeil. Vulgar History listeners can always get 15% off anything you buy from Common Era by going to commonera.com/vulgar or using code VULGAR at checkout. If you want to support this show specifically, merch is available at vulgarhistory.com/store. That's for all of you Americans. If you're outside the US, then I recommend using our alternate store, vulgarhistory.redbubble.com. And in terms of Pride Month and that sort of thing, one of the designs that we have in the shop is of the trans sister, the iconic trans woman who has also appeared in the recent TV show Franklin, starring Michael Douglas. Le Chevalier d'Eon, who I've done an episode about as well. But it's a beautiful design that was made by a queer trans artist named Jan Jupiter, who I've partnered with for a lot of merch. And it's a picture of the Chevalier d'Eon looking amazing in her trademark black outfit, long skirt and a headpiece, fencing, which is a thing she did. And it said, "We have always been here," just saying trans people have always been here. So that is something you might be interested in. You can get a sticker, on a mug, on a t-shirt from the various merch stores. I'll put a link to that in the show notes just because it's Pride Month and I want to highlight that design specifically. Also, actually, if you're interested in other episodes of Vulgar History that have been about people from the 2S LGBTQIA plus community, I have made a playlist of those on Spotify. There's, I want to say 20-something episodes. So it includes episodes where I'm talking, episodes where I have guests, episodes where it's an author talking about a book that they've written about a queer historical person. The whole playlist is there. So you can just really celebrate Pride by listening to stories of the kind of audacious dirtbags that I like to celebrate on this show. As Greta LaFleur said, I think it's worth celebrating trans people, queer people from history who are also kind of assholes. The heroes and the assholes alike. If you want to get in touch with me, if you go to vulgarhistory.com, there's a form there that sends an email right to me if you have thoughts or feedback. If you live somewhere around where the Sampson Shurtleff house is, or if you've been to any of these museums, I'd love to know. I'm not a well-traveled person, and I love to see other people's pictures and stories about museums and stuff that you visited. You can also keep up with me on Instagram at Vulgar History Pod, where my DMs are open, so you can also send me pictures of your travels there as well. Anyway, my friends, happy Pride Month. Let's burn it all down. And next week, I think I said, but just to clarify, next week is going to be another Pride-themed episode, another American history-themed episode, and another trans history episode with a very special returning guest I hope you're all really excited about. I'm really excited about. But until next time, keep your pants on and your tits out. Vulgar History is researched, written, and hosted by Anne Foster. That's me. The editor is Christina Lumagi. Theme music is by the Severn Duo. The Vulgar History show image is by Deborah Wong. Transcripts are written by Aveline Malik. Find transcripts of recent episodes at vulgarhistory.com.
Talmor, Shishin Magachi. Talmor is my home. My family have worked the land for generations. My gran says the island does not belong to us, but we belong to the island. And we must be ready, for a great evil is coming, and death follows with it.
Listen and subscribe to the latest season of Undertow, The Harrowing, a Storyglass production presented by Realm, available wherever you get your podcasts.
Do you know what lies within nothing?
No.
Do you know where it ends? Do you want to know?
Yes.
Counterbalance, a high fantasy audio drama. Season 2, coming 15th of October 2023. Learn more on trilunas.com.